Hello, I'm Sarah Polan, and you're watching the Cloud Therapist channel.
Hello and welcome to the Cloud Therapist channel. I'm Richard Simon. This talk is all about Kubernetes, its origins, its impact, and its future as well. It's kind of loosely based on the documentary, which is, I think, created by Honeypot, and it's in collaboration with Google, Red Hat, and the CNCF. We're kind of going to really explore the origins of Kubernetes a little bit, kind of try and reminisce a little bit about kind of where we were when we first heard about Kubernetes. And kind of talk about sort of how it really became the phenomenon that it is, and kind of really also look at the, it's kind of the launching of all the ecosystem around us, so things like the CNCF and so on. We'll kind of maybe touch on that as well. So we'll look at it, like I said, kind of from it, where it is today, and then also speculate going towards sort of the future. So I have an absolute super panel for you today. Now, I won't be able to do their intros any justice at all because I'm just not, they're just too cool for me to do, to do that. So I'll probably ask them to do the intros, and we'll go with Sarah first, please.
Sure. My name is Sarah Polan. I'm the field CTO covering EMEA for HashiCorp.
Excellent. Victor, if you don't mind going second.
I'm working Abound, mostly focused on crossplane.
Excellent. And Jay?
Cool. I'm Jay Keshur. I'm COO and co-founder at a company called Appia, looking after developer self-service in cloud.
Fantastic. Okay, excellent, guys. Thank you for the intro. So let's kind of, the documentary sort of really starts with a little bit of a discussion around the sort of the dawn of containers in Kubernetes, and sort of starts the conversation there. I think where we are now, kind of with cloud native and DevOps and containerization and so on, we had to kind of probably give the credit to Docker, kind of really coming up with their sort of platform and standard. So the first, I think, announcement for that was in the .scale conference 2013. Whatever happened to that? Is that still running? I'm not sure. But that was kind of the yeah, that's the kind of a thing, the initial sort of point when really containers sort of landed in the form that we understand them. The likes of IBM and doing LPARs and things like that for much longer than that. So yeah, so that's kind of really where I guess it started. But the first question I kind of want to really ask was, when was the kind of the first time you guys heard about actually containers? When was kind of maybe the year, if you can recall, and what was kind of your impression of that? Maybe Sarah, to go to you first.
Yeah, so I'm about to reveal a lot here. I'm on my third career, so I'm late to the IT game. So once I started full swing IT development and into the cybersecurity realm, containers was already pretty well established. So I think the first time that I got really hands-on with any sort of containerization was probably around 2016, and that would have been actually Docker Swarm. That was my foray into containers before I pivoted into the Kubernetes space.
Cool. Victor?
I heard about it shortly after that conference, right? And it something immediately clicked and said, "This is so amazing," and then something else says, "This is so useless." At the same time, right?
Okay, so just sticking to the positive. What was the positive that you thought? What was that thing that clicked? I'm interested in hearing that.
Have two things. First, have a standard way to package and distribute applications, right? Because until then, it was whatever you want, right? Zip it up. And the second thing was, hey, this namespaces and other goodies that were reserved for only special people in the industry, because containers existed for many years before Docker, right? But now this is suddenly useful, sorry. This suddenly is easy, and everybody can do things that were reserved for Googlers, right?
What about you, Jay?
Yeah, probably a little bit earlier, so maybe like 2011, 2012. So around sort of LXC, LXC days. But again, I think not until Docker kind of democratizing the sort of developer experience around it was it actually sort of useful, or did I get proper sort of hands-on with it.
Right. Okay.
And that was in what, 2014.
Yeah.
So
okay, cool. So I mean, I think I was probably slightly late as well. I think I was at SUSE when I first sort of heard really about sort of containers, and I think it was like actually a combination. So it was a sort of a double whammy for me of containers and orchestration. And so I was like, wow, what's all this stuff? It's a bit crazy, but excellent. Yeah. Okay. And I actually had heard of, I think the kind of, we had, when I was prior to that, I was at IBM. So we kind of did things like OpenStack and stuff like that. So, you know, the KVMs and things were sort of coming in at that point. At least we're kind of becoming more legitimate as, you know, sort of platforms that we can use in production. Whereas kind of before they were maybe more Zen and sort of KVM were kind of more confined to, you know, kind of the open source world. But yeah, that was, I think, I was kind of really when it first kind of, you know, impacted for me. Okay, so the documentary kind of shows things like a shot of servers and cables, which kind of made me a little bit dizzy when I looked at that. It's kind of, you know, QLogic, I think fiber channel cards and optic cables and SFP days and, you know, SANs. So that was a bit kind of dodgy for me. But going beyond that and forgiving that and moving on. I think Kelsey said at some point that there was a kind of a sort of a meeting point of sort of cloud computing, DevOps, and automation. And I think it was all coming in sort of at that time. So Sarah, I wanted to ask you, when was kind of the first time you actually were sort of, you know, introduced to DevOps, or kind of, you know, exposed to DevOps as sort of, you know, sort of mantra?
Yeah, well, again, because I'm so late comparatively to the game, that was really my first kind of inflection point. And so as I was going back to school and, you know, reskilling and going through this whole IT transformation, DevOps, Agile, that was all very front and forward. And so we learned that. So by the time I was really into the software development side of things, being exposed to things like Kubernetes, orchestration, containerization, that was already part of that curriculum and really built into that. So I actually had to go backwards. And when I was working in financial services, that's where I was actually exposed to all of the, you know, the optic cables and the mainframes and the proper hardware. Because before that, it was all just virtualization, because that's kind of the inflection point that I came into. For better or for worse, I don't know. I have a great point of view of some things and lacking in others. So I think it's really interesting to watch this evolve as well.
Cool. And Viktor, for you, did that kind of whole space, you said that something clicked with Docker, but did that sort of more extended space of DevOps and automation, did that kind of all make sense at the same time, or was it kind of a trickle effect for you?
If by DevOps you mean automation, let's face it, we've been doing automation from the very beginning, right? It's not something new. DevOps is a concept that operations and developers should work together instead of focusing on automation. That was relatively new, meaning that, hey, there are actually people behind those servers. Imagine that.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think and then the documentary kind of goes on to things like, you know, cloud and AWS. Amazon sort of running away with the, you know, the lead of that. I didn't really understand why Joe Bader, and I've met Joe Bader because he and Craig McCluskey were actually the founders of Heptio, and I actually did work for Heptio back in 2018 before the VMware acquisition. So I was a bit surprised when he said, oh, you know, and it gave us a fighting chance. And I thought, okay, but, you know, you guys could have thought about this as well at Google. So it's kind of just made a little bit, sound a little bit, you know, sort of slightly bitter kind of in terms of, you know, AWS was kind of ahead of us. They thought of, you know, public cloud first or something like that. Okay.
That fighting chance in documentary is very, very interesting sentence, because if you look at it in retrospective today, who is the main beneficiary among hyperscalers of Kubernetes today.
Yeah.
100%. But that's like, I guess Amazon does that with pretty much every technology that starts off open source, right? So
yeah, indeed. Yeah. What was kind of the, I'm sure it kind of wasn't, all the stuff wasn't huge in those days, and we know that because it kind of hadn't really taken over the world just yet. But is it, Sarah, what's kind of your take when you talk to customers about this whole space and kind of customers moving away from virtualization eventually and things like that? Is it, is everybody kind of convinced and moving forward, or is there still, people that we have to kind of convince?
I think yes and no, and especially as we see this kind of pivot back onto on-prem or private cloud, I think the question then becomes, what is best going to serve companies? Because all of a sudden, it feels like we're kind of at a fork in the road. Business is saying we need to be able to scale, and we need to be able to like make sure that we're actually turning a profit off of these things. So these DevOps teams, they need to be more productive than they are currently and more scalable than they are currently. But at the same time, developers want to move fast, and there is a lot of value to containerizations. And I think especially immutable infrastructure, which is one of the huge benefits I think that you get from a security perspective, certainly from something like containerization, because we can just blow it all down and then rebuild it back up. So then if we have some sort of threat or we need to recover, or business continuity purposes, I think a lot of people are starting to see that there's a real value behind containerization and orchestration in that sense. On the other side, though, it's really hard to scale. And as somebody, I used to run a team that was security focused within the Kubernetes space. We had a lot of challenges. How do you set up your clusters to make sure that they're responding to Conway's law, but at the same time, you're not using so much compute and, blowing your costs out just because you have too many clusters, or conversely, you're running a load that's too heavy, or, you have a bunch of different business units attached to the same cluster, and all of a sudden you have too many nodes and you can't scale those nodes anymore because you're constricted by an IP space. So there's a lot more complexity that goes into designing these systems and architecting these systems. And I think a lot of organizations, especially the really large organizations, get a little bit stuck when they're doing this. And so they're hitting a little bit of a wall and starting to question, is this the way forward? It seemed like a really great idea at the time, but how can we make sure that this is a scalable idea?
Sure. Okay. Yeah. And then the documentary kind of goes on to admit that sort of, Docker did really change the world. I think it was kind of the starting point of things like abstraction was used, treating infrastructure as code. I think Kelsey Hightower also mentioned as well. And Kubernetes is kind of based around this promise theory as well, which I'll probably include some stuff in the description of the video. Won't have time to go through that at the moment. But this kind of orchestration technology, that Google was using at the time around their internal project called Borg, I believe. Was kind of really what I think Craig McLuckie and Joe Bader were kind of trying to really, be able to use something like that. And I was quite surprised that they actually said, we wanted to open source it almost straight away, which I thought was actually quite admirable that they did want to do that. And they obviously, found some resistance and bureaucracy within Google for that. But there was that need, again, I think Joe Bader said there was kind of a need to disrupt and create a kind of a Borg-like system, I think, as he put it. Obviously, there was other ones around at the time, Mesos and maybe potentially OpenStack and others were around. Viktor, do you remember kind of Mesos and OpenStack and stuff like that? Did you ever kind of have a go at those at the time?
I do remember. If the question is whether I want to remember it, then the answer is no.
Yeah. So an apologies for reminding you.
Exactly. You owe me 3 sessions with a psychiatrist. Now, yeah, that time.
Well, I am
Mesos
the therapist, so you can always be on my Cloud Therapist couch. So you're more than welcome to.
Depends. Can you prescribe meds or no?
I'll come back to you on that.
But yeah, Mesos was the only orchestration at the time that actually was proven to be reliable, to work, to do the things that need to be done at scale, right? It wasn't designed around Docker, around containers, but that was the only option, right? Only later, Docker came up with Swarm and Kubernetes. Google folks came up with Kubernetes. But if you step back a bit before those, right, it was Mesos. That was the only player in town.
Okay, cool.
All right. Mesos with Marathon, right? So it was even with Mesos, it was like a complicated ecosystem. You had to run Mesos, Marathon, Zookeeper, you know, so it's just a lot.
Right.
So I think Kubernetes definitely sort of simplified the game a little bit.
If you look at the first release of Kubernetes, right? When setting it up with kubeadm, Kelsey having to write the whole book only so that you can have it set it up without doing anything, right?
Right.
It was a nightmare, Kubernetes, that at the very, very beginning. So I agree when you said simplified, but that's a bit, you know, fast forward a couple of years.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that was kubeadmin didn't even exist at the time. So it was the, you know, the hard way, and that was only what, 2017, end of 2016, something like that.
Right.
So yeah, we definitely went on that journey.
Right. So in the sort of the critical mass sort of point, I think when they said Craig McCluskey actually came up with the name, and he happened to be driving and something about a steering wheel or something like that. I think that's how they came up with it. And somebody did the graphics internally for the logo. And they asked, I think, when Brendan Burns, I think, got sort of involved in it, he kind of put together some scripts, and those scripts were the origin of it, which was, I think they called it 7 of 9, which is kind of based on obviously Star Trek Voyager's character, and then they reduced it just to 7 as a sort of an internal code name. Apparently, it was just a bunch of scripts at the time, but it was quite impressive to Craig and Joe Bader as well. So that's kind of how they went from there. And again, like I said, there was a lot of resistance about kind of open sourcing it, but then they had the support from Eric Brewer, which I think is one of the VPs or the VP at the time. And they said he said it was too big and too precious to Google at the time, and that was kind of the main resistance. But so it took, apparently the approval took 6 months, but actually kind of knocking out the first version took 3 months to do. But it was quite a sort of an incubation period, I guess, to get it out. Mostly politics within Google fighting over it. Okay, and then so is the kind of the reason that we don't have any sort of other orchestrators competing today, or not to the level of Kubernetes' sort of supremacy, is that because of and we kind of just touched on it with you, Viktor, is that because of kind of Kubernetes sort of success and its simplification of things as it went along?
I would say it's the other way around, right? Kubernetes success, as we know today, is because of the wide adoption, right? Not because it's better or worse. I mean, it is in many different ways. It's not in some others, but it's because of the adoption, right? And when I say adoption, I don't mean end user adoption. I mean vendor adoption. Projects building something on top of it, right? And that's thanks to essentially the design. While Mesos and Swarm were focused on Mesos on scheduling and scale, and Swarm on simplicity, Kubernetes was all about extensible API, right? You could not plug in something into Mesos or Docker that easily, right? Docker Swarm. You can plug anything into Kubernetes. And the second thing is CNCF, right? Because if you as a company, if you want to invest something, right, your own money, your own time into something, you want to go with the safer option, right? As a company, Docker is infinitely less safe than Kubernetes in CNCF, simply because, hey, one is owned by a company, another one is owned by a foundation.
Cool. And I think that's also the genius behind how Kubernetes has evolved, generally speaking, is that, you have the CNCF, which I didn't realize is very much built around the governance of Kubernetes. But then it is because they were trying to find ways to make it extensible. So essentially you have this ecosystem or this platform And then everything around it really centers around how does it consume in a native capacity from what's offered as this platform. And I think what's really interesting also is as we go down this road and we're seeing DevOps kind of evolve into platform engineering, because that's a way we can just make it a little bit more scalable. It's really starting to fit this mold. And so you start wondering, is the dog wagging the tail, or is the tail wagging the dog, sort of, in this particular situation? And I find that fascinating. And I think that by and large is a huge part of why Kubernetes is as successful as it is. Because if you go to KubeCon or if you go to any of these CNCF events, the buzz and the enthusiasm of the people who are building and innovating around this ecosystem is incredible. I was just there last week. It was 14,000 people, largest KubeCon to date, apparently. And it just, everyone is so excited and collaborative. And I think that, as an innovator, that's also where you move things forward. And I think, Kubernetes is no exception to that.
Yeah.
You're spot on. I think the kind of change in the sort of open source ecosystem that CNCF created. So there was a part of the documentary where they called out having to sign up to someone else's contributing guides or whatever. And I thought that was genius. Just the fact that you are creating this whole foundation so that you're not signing up to another company's contributing guides, so that it can be owned. So how are you funding an ecosystem of developers wanting to do something that they've kind of just taken open source and given it a bunch of steroids? So yeah, I thought that was great.
Yeah, so I think that the kind of early cooperation, coordinating everybody, and so co-opetition, is it co-opetition? I think as they call it. Yeah, competition. Yeah, optician. Yeah, I think that was kind of the definitely the driver. Okay, so let's kind of get onto the 2014, which is the first release. So Red Hat kind of, I think, got involved at this point. They were looking at the guys, I think, were looking at OpenShift 3 release, and they kind of apparently helped sort of to clean up the code. So that was very, I think, appreciated by the guys at Google. And then the official announcement, I think, was at DockerCon 2014. That was the 10th of June, apparently, 2014. Was any of you guys at DockerCon 2014? Ah, Victor was.
Oh, wow.
Okay. What do you remember?
Early
do you remember
adapter.
do you remember anything about it, Victor? Oh, you're on mute.
I don't remember what I did 10 years ago. Kidding. I mean, it
I
was a lot
remember
of
last
excitement.
week, let alone 10 years
Exactly.
ago.
So, yeah, I mean, there was a lot. That's the period where we cannot replicate that excitement anymore, right? It was massive. And everybody knew at that time that containers alone are not going to be very helpful. Yes, on your laptop, you run tests or whatever, but that we need some kind of orchestration. So it was very, very exciting, because that's when things started happening, right? That's when Mesos started going towards containers. That's when the Docker started working. No, actually releasing Swarm, and Kubernetes was announced, and 57 other projects that disappeared afterwards, right?
Yeah. And I think at the same conference, there were other announcements. As you said, Docker's, I think, first version was LibSwarm, they called it. Facebook released Tupperware. And Heroku.
Great name, by the way.
Yeah, very catchy, right? And Heroku was the other one there. So Victor, you touched on it very briefly earlier about kind of the differences and the success. Was that kind of the main things that you remember, or were there any other reasons why the other orchestrators didn't really catch on as much? I mean, Facebook was probably flying at that point, so why didn't kind of Tupperware really pick up?
So at that point, nothing really picked up yet, except Mesos, right? Whether something picked up or no, that's okay. A few years later, right? At that point, everybody was excited about everything, right? And nobody knew what to do. I mean, I was investing heavily in Mesos at that time, and then we were thinking switching to Swarm or Kubernetes, but all of those are not mature. Nothing picked up yet. In terms of having a wide consensus, this is the thing.
Okay, right.
Hey, if you enjoyed this talk, please press this button. Press it now.
Excellent.
Button is to subscribe, by the way.
Bit of ad-libbing. There you go.
I'll try and put that up. All right. So yeah, so that was kind of the first announcement. Now, I think we may differ on this, but we kind of said that sort of the orchestration wars kind of started after that period when that announcement was made. Obviously, like we said, because they had things like libswarm, Polan, and what have you there as well. Obviously, there was a lot of competition going on. And we talked about kind of, I think, Viktor, you mentioned quite rightly, kind of, the simplification of things like Docker Swarm, the scheduling capabilities of some of the others. Those were kind of the main things. And I picked up on one quote from the documentary. It said, Kubernetes at that time was put together by duct tape. It was held together by duct tape, which I thought was quite interesting.
It was horrible.
Yes.
No, really.
I was just trying to be diplomatic there.
Everybody was very clear that the idea is there. The idea is amazing,
Yeah.
but I dare you to try it. You go back in time and try it.
Yeah,
you would hate yourself.
Yeah, and especially some of the big players like Netflix, Apple, Airbnb apparently were all using Mesos at the time as well. So that was quite interesting. Okay, yeah. So the kind of Kubernetes focused on sort of the developers, the application mindset, stateless. I think low scale web apps was the quote that I got from one of the guys in the interview as well. That was kind of their main focus at the time. So Viktor, kind of coming back to you, do we have capability even today of doing containers without orchestration? Is that still kind of something that people can go out and do, or is there just not enough of that, or bravery enough to want to do that?
I mean, we have the capability to do it without orchestration. We have it long before Kubernetes appeared. The question is not whether we have a capability, but whether we want it, right? Yeah, and yes, if you're running if your company is so small that you have a single server, you want to run Docker, why not? I mean, forget about Docker, just SSH it at the server and copy the jar file, right? But the moment you go bigger, and you don't have to go big, you need orchestration of some form, right?
Right. And so this was kind of a fairly unique time with all these sort of things happening. So it's quite exciting. I can't really recall prior to that, and you guys may because you may be in the open source space, longer than I had been. What was kind of the apart from virtualization, and thanks to the likes of VMware sort of really making that mainstream, has there kind of been any other sort of uniques like that, these kind of paradigms that we've seen before or since?
Maybe. Okay. I'd say probably like configuration management tools. So, back if you look at the sort of ecosystem in 2013, 14, or whatever, the alternatives were Puppet, Chef, Ansible, and then Docker came around and changed the entire paradigm, right? So if you think of like, I think Sarah mentioned earlier about sort of immutable infrastructure, and how much that sort of changes that dev experience, that security and risk mitigation. Before Docker, that configuration management thing was the most exciting thing. It's like, how am I going to get this thing running consistently across every environment? But then I have to get some people to write some hierarchy, some Puppet or Ruby code or whatever. So not ideal. And then Docker is like, get a container, throw it over, put it into some Tupperware or whatever else. But I don't think there's been anything exciting since then.
Yeah.
But funnily enough, I think, once you start looking at, we've kind of approached this on the application level, and now we're trying to go through the same thing again, but again on the infrastructure level. And how do you enable teams again to be more DevOpsy? And so one of the things that a lot of people are throwing around right now is, how do I get that orchestration on an infrastructure layer? And there's a lot of talk around dynamic config management and how do you handle dynamic config management. So I think it's very much that pendulum. You see it swing from one end to the other. Sometimes it's application driven, sometimes it's infrastructure driven, but usually you end up somewhere in the middle and then it shifts again.
Cool. Okay. Right. So next is OSCON 2015. I think that's when they released version 1.0 of Kubernetes. Victor, were you at OSCON 2015?
I wasn't at OSCON, no.
Ah, and we were on such a good run there.
Almost, yeah.
Almost. Okay. Right. So was anybody else at OSCON 2015? No.
Nope.
Okay. Nobody was there. Okay. Right. Fair enough. So yes, that's kind of when they released the first version. And apparently the guys who wrote Pokemon Go, according to the documentary, Niantic, is a company called Niantic, were actually one of the early adopters of Kubernetes. And they found out pretty quickly how to scale their clusters, which was quite interesting. But they were early adopters, and I think it was actually a good good use case as well.
They're adopters of GKE specifically, right? So Kubernetes on Google, which is very different to kind of Kubernetes on just VMs, like having to do things the sort of hard way. Like we kind of ran Kubernetes in production on 0.6 for the home office in 2015. So so you can imagine the effort and kind of risk that was kind of taken at that point when the project wasn't even at 1.0 release. So whereas the effort that they took on a cloud provided supported service, you saw all of the Google engineers obviously like turning the handle, being up 24/7 and trying to make sure that those clusters weren't going down with that crazy scale. But pretty good.
Okay, so home office really brave. I'm quite impressed.
I've heard several stories about the home office that really just blow my mind in terms of innovation and how they approach software. It's amazing.
I'm gonna make a note and see if I can talk to somebody from the home office in my next talk. Okay, excellent. All right. So one thing that's kind of is slightly of a bugbear for me is when people start naming their version releases. So Kubernetes wasn't doing that, and they've kind of started doing that, and they kind of follow it in various footsteps. Victor, what's the idea behind naming your version numbers?
I'm not sure. I did not know until now that Kubernetes was ever named versions.
Yeah, they have started that. I don't know which version, but quite. I think it's quite recently from the recent releases. All I can say,
they name the release teams, I think, not the actual version. So the versions still have numbers.
They still have the versions, but they still do the the whatever names afterwards. The kind of funny names that they put onto the.
I think you're right. It's teams are named so that you know whom to blame.
Yeah. All I can say is OpenStack. They were doing the same thing, and look where that went. Okay, so won't say any more. Okay, so at this point as well is, as we said earlier, CNCF was born, and that was kind of to nurture and administer sort of the progress of development of Kubernetes. As we said, that was quite an important, I think, step. I think Craig McLuckie called it a rich base of support, I think was the quote that I got from that. And it was kind of bootstrapping the committee, bootstrapping the committee apparently. And then Sarah Novotny, I think, is one of the ladies who kind of was brought in to do more of the governance aspect of it. And it was kind of a so-called quote unquote distributed governance, which I thought was quite cool. And we, I think, touched on some of the earlier points of that. So by 2016, again, according to the documentary rather, version 1.2 had between 700 and 1,000 contributors. So they were kind of reaching burnout point. Failure was imminent, according to the documentary. Sounds like sort of red lights and red alerts and whatever going on at Kubernetes HQ. So they introduced things like project management leads and whatever to kind of make it a little bit more mainstream. So yes, I think we kind of touched on CNCF, so I'll kind of skip the skip the points that we wanted to really say about that. But Jay, was that kind of one of the catalysts for sort of the wide adoption? Do you think it kind of established that sort of wider base of agreement, whereas maybe the other projects didn't do that?
Honestly, I reckon the biggest adoption came from the cloud vendors. Well, more so Amazon and Microsoft having their own managed Kubernetes offerings. Like GK, of course, you know, they started Borg, they invented Kubernetes. Of course, they're going to have a managed offering, but it was quite sort of niche to just them. As soon as you know, the kind of larger sort of hyperscalers had their own offerings, I reckon the kind of it created a bit of a hockey curve of adoption. Containers and Kubernetes and orchestration, that wasn't just something that you do if you're going to be doing some big data stuff on Google. It's stuff that you do if you're on cloud. And then all of the services that have kind of existed and being created beyond that. So you don't just necessarily have like a Kubernetes plane to throw your applications against, but now you can containerize your applications and maybe chuck it over the fence to a cloud provider, and they'll think about how to orchestrate and schedule with you know, their own sort of container instances or ECS or whatever else. So I think that's probably been the biggest. It's the lack of lock-in that I reckon has sped up that adoption. And well, obviously the ecosystem has matured so much, right? So you're not just getting scheduling and orchestration, you're getting certificates, you're getting secrets, you're getting all of this stuff around the edges that actually solves some pretty gnarly problems.
Cool. Okay, so I think the documentary kind of flip-flopped between orchestration wars and somebody said container wars and so on as well. So we get to DockerCon 2017, and I think that's when everybody kind of threw in the towel for you know, on orchestration. So Docker announced support for Kubernetes. I think Mesos did the same and changed their name at the same time or something. Pivotal obviously did that as well. And I think that was when AWS launched EKS, as my understanding was, according to the documentary as well. I did look that up, I think. So Sarah, what's the writing on the wall when that happened? Did you think, and because of what we've been talking about, the momentum behind Kubernetes, was that inevitable? I have to say, I read a couple of things at the time, and I felt that Docker was going to do that. I wasn't really aware of DockerCon and they were going to do it then, but I just thought they've got, you know, these guys have got to do it now. Because, you know, Kubernetes is really picking up around that time. What was kind of your thoughts on that, Sarah?
Yeah, I think it was sort of inevitable to a certain extent, and they touched upon it in the documentary, in that they really found that middle ground, and they got a lot of really experienced people who had been through some of these challenges within their development lifecycle and what they had experienced within other companies. And that really drove the granularity and the modularity of Kubernetes, which I think is really what makes it as powerful as it is and makes it, well, has made the adoption so great across the board. So I think when you were looking at that, and, you know, Docker Swarm, which was looking at a broader problem and trying to unify individual pieces together into like one machine almost. And then you have Mesos on the other side, which was really skilled at scheduling, but then on the orchestration side, a little bit lacking. And then you had sort of the Goldilocks of orchestration, which ended up being Kubernetes. It found the balance between these two problems.
That's a great way to put it, actually, as the Goldilocks for orchestration. So I just, as we're just talking, something occurred to me. How I mean, it must be really interesting and maybe even slightly sort of intimidating when, you know, you're almost kind of in a dark room and you're just sort of feeling your way around, you know, this new thing that's happening, orchestration. And yeah, sure. I mean, there was, you know, others and kind of been doing it for a while, but it's now kind of, you know, solidified around 2017. These people have all said, yeah, Kubernetes and so on. And now you're sort of, you know, at that point, you're kind of going, oh my God, I can actually see a light in the room and head towards that light. So Viktor, what's kind of your thoughts around that?
Sorry, I misunderstood the question.
I was just saying about, you know, kind of Kubernetes now sort of, you know, being pretty much the sort of the established
yes,
you know, orchestrator. But before that, there wasn't kind of, you know, there's that thing, let's go towards it. And then along the way, we'll learn what we need to do. There was no destination as such. There was a kind of an idea and concept, but didn't know kind of where it was going to land.
Yeah, I mean, at that time, all those that we mentioned before dropped off, you know, Tupperware, what's or not. Even Mesos was becoming pretty obvious that Mesos is not going to be the thing. You know, finally, we could get rid of the thing that we hate. At least that was my interpretation, right? But it was not yet, you said earlier, and I disagree with that part, that's when Docker threw in the towel. I don't think that they did.
Okay.
Right? Docker was publicly promising we are going to support this thing called Kubernetes, but we are going stronger than ever with Swarm, right? And actually, there were much more sessions about Swarm that year. I think that was Copenhagen than Kubernetes, right? If anything, I would say that was the pivotal moment when, if Docker threw in the towel that year, they would have been in a different place, better place than they're right now, right?
Yeah.
But at that moment, we were between those two. At least that's how I feel. It was Swarm and Kubernetes. Okay, head to head, very different purposes, very different experiences. But we did not finish yet. I feel that maybe a year later, it was, okay, now it's Kubernetes. Now it's clear.
Right. Jay, what was your take on that? Do you kind of agree with that, disagree?
Yeah,
One of us, all of us.
I think I agree with Viktor. I mean, Docker were very much trying to, you know, remember they're a startup that have solved a very big problem in an ecosystem and added a lot to everyone's lives. But they weren't necessarily monetizing anything, right? So they needed to figure out a way to not just be VC backed and make some money.
Yeah, which is quite important at that time, right? When you're sort of doing that startup and then you've got something phenomenal on your hands.
Yeah, exactly. So it's very much about, all right, we have to do what everyone's asking us to do, support Kubernetes, but we're going to double down onto Swarm or EE or whatever and they ended up calling it. But it's I think it was more sort of being backed into a corner of, and then doubling down on how to actually monetize what they've done. Okay. It's a bit, to be fair, it's a bit sad. Like it, you know, they did so much for the ecosystem and then not being able to kind of take advantage of that. I can definitely see their side of it, which is Kubernetes and Google. They sort of took that whole thing and created a whole, like their go to market with CNCF and all of that kind of stuff was just fantastic. And there was no beating it. And so they couldn't really compete.
That was actually, I believe, I might be wrong about the year now, but that was the time when we started having actually conflicts about Docker itself, when Swarm was baked into Docker and Kubernetes was very much against having container runtime that does trillion different things, right? That's when actually almost threats to Docker started appearing, kind of, hey, if you don't remove things, we're going to actually get rid of Docker altogether, which eventually happened, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. OCI and Containerd and everything else.
Right.
Yeah,
indeed. Excellent. Okay, so I think that's kind of pretty much really where the documentary sort of finished. Unfortunately, they didn't kind of do any crystal ball gazing sort of as to the future of Kubernetes. Maybe they just kind of wanted to leave that open and sort of set off in the sunset kind of thing. You know, a Western style sort of film ending. Okay, but we can certainly explore a little bit about the future of Kubernetes. So let's kind of dive into that a little bit. One of the things I kind of wanted to ask is, I think the community sort of, when they say something has become boring, it's kind of, you know, mature and, you know, it's production ready and so on. All the people were sort of brave enough to do it with version 0.6 now that we know. Thank you very much, Jay, for that little tidbit of information. But what's the, you know, has kind of, Kubernetes now sort of reached its peak? What's next for Kubernetes? What do you think, Sarah?
I think it's really going to depend on where the CNCF wants to take it. If they want to start making it more commercially available, I think there's still a lot of things, having run it in production and run it for security programs, that still could use a little bit of finesse. Generally speaking, there's still not a lot of people who can run it and who can run it well. And so learning how to kind of streamline some of these things, whether that's making the usability just easier or built-in security or the ecosystem that keeps expanding on top of that. I think all of that's really important. And I think the innovation that's behind the CNCF that drives the ecosystem. So maybe we just see a pivot to the ecosystem and more focus on what's happening around it.
Okay. So, I mean, I remember sort of dabbling with, when things like CSI and CNI were in tree, and that kind of drove me mad with those early versions of Kubernetes. So, Viktor, what's feedback from you and sort of the developer community around what they would like to see next from Kubernetes? Any bits of sort of information from you on that?
Yeah. There are quite a few things that will happen, but not necessarily directly in Kubernetes. Kubernetes has been shrinking, actually, not expanding. And when I say Kubernetes, I mean Kubernetes itself, excluding the ecosystem, right? Introduction of basically networking was removed from Kubernetes, right? That's why we have CNIs now and so on and so forth. We're getting to the place where it's clear that Kubernetes is not something you should use. Kubernetes is a base on top of which you're going to do things, right? Just like you use Linux distribution, you don't compile your own kernel and so on and so forth. So the things that have to happen is first that Kubernetes have to become an implementation detail, right? I don't necessarily have to see Kubernetes, right? And we are seeing that. If you look at Azure Container Apps, that's a good example of I don't see Kubernetes, right? It's implementation detail, just as I don't work with hypervisors anymore, right? I spin up EC2 instance. I don't know what is a hypervisor because I don't care, right?
Yeah.
And the other thing that will happen is simply the continuous expansion of the API, right? Through third parties, right? I feel, and this is where many people probably disagree with me, right? I see containers as being beachhead, right? That's how we conquered that space. But containers are not the end game, right? Kubernetes as orchestrator is expandable API. That's what continues, right? And we are going to see much more usage of Kubernetes. Wasm will be running in Kubernetes. We will be managing infrastructure with Kubernetes and so on and so forth.
Okay, Jay, what's your take?
Yeah, I think you're 100% right. So WASM, the kind of introduction of, say, eBPF and things like that are quite exciting. I don't like, to be fair, I don't think there's been a huge amount of excitement after like CRDs were introduced and that like the kind of method of being able to expand and extend Kubernetes in that operator type model. Since then, there's not been, I don't think, a huge amount of kind of excitement around what they're building next. It's just a continuation. And also, now that sort of cloud providers have again taken away the headache of managing Kubernetes clusters and things like that, you're not like back in the day, you used to kind of look out for a major release and be looking at the change logs and like, oh, what's changed? I've got a new resource definition that I can start using, whatever. Now it's just like, yeah, cool. I know I'm going to be using Helm charts and deployments and that, but it's just a bit of the same thing now.
Okay, so it's definitely kind of reached that boring maturity stage. I mean, actually talking about that, I had a chat with the CEO of Civo, which is kind of they see themselves as a sort of alternative public cloud to the top three, and he said that actually the way they provide their sort of Kubernetes as a service is that they don't charge for the control plane. I don't know if the others do, but they certainly make a big deal out of that, and sort of the utilization and costs are a lot more streamlined on their platform, which was quite interesting. I think we may, as we said, maybe Kubernetes itself sort of is contracting down to kind of being those core elements, as Viktor said, and then the rest of the sort of innovations around the distribution or whatever platform is running on, and then the innovation is around kind of, okay, how do we provide it? So like, the likes of Siva sort of doing some tricks there with how they.
I will be a negative guy here, but I think that we're not having much innovation anymore, right? We had an explosion of innovation in Kubernetes for years, but if you look at the last couple of KubeCons, let's say, right, maybe since CBPF, nothing really new, exciting is happening. And I'm not saying that is a bad thing, right? That means that it's mature. But it's not like anymore you go to KubeCon and then you hear 57 new things that you never heard of before, and kind of you're so excited. That's not happening. There is no innovation. It's consolidation right now.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing.
Yeah, I do agree. And I think that is a sign of sort of its maturity. Definitely. Yeah, and I do agree again. I think you guys mentioned eBPF. That's certainly an interesting one, and I think there is a documentary on that, so I might end up doing a review of that at some point as well. Okay, so yeah, I think around sort of distributions, it just seems to be, as we said, sort of it's all settled down after that sort of initial excitement. Okay, so just kind of final thoughts from you guys, I think, on it. Is there anything that is kind of missing? People have kind of missed something around sort of Kubernetes as it is at the moment, or indeed its ecosystem, but also just kind of general sort of thinking around sort of where do you think it's kind of heading? Anything else that we might see in that? Sarah, can I start with you?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, where's it heading? I actually just had this actual conversation with John Collins a few days ago. Sorry. And I think our consensus that we kind of came to was that it's now about how do you build it out and how do you scale it and how do you take this thing that's become much more mature and is in a space that's going to allow actual organizations to innovate as opposed to the underlying and supporting infrastructure innovate. So I'm really looking forward to seeing some of the more streamlined organizations, mainstream organizations bring this forward and really start using it as a tool as opposed to something to play with in their organizations and kind of figure out, because I think it's really starting to step up into more of a supporting role than cool tech at this point.
Right. Viktor?
Yeah, it needs to disappear. I mean, disappear below the layers of that makes it useless, because I feel that we live in a bubble in terms that even in this show, you mentioned a couple of times developers, right? Developers do not care about Kubernetes and they cannot use Kubernetes. Let's face it, as it is now, right? We need to get those abstraction layers on top that will actually make Kubernetes useful to everybody, right? And then we're talking, right? It needs to become equivalent to VC2, right?
Yeah, what's your sort of take on sort of future thoughts on it, and so anything else that you feel is missing?
We've spoken for a whole hour and not mentioned AI once, which is amazing. Like
AI and Kubernetes.
And you're gonna ruin it.
Yeah, I know exactly.
We were doing so well there, Jay.
But I was just thinking, like the next shift could be, like Viktor said, sort of removing Kubernetes entirely to something that learns about your application, that learns about how to keep it scalable, to keep it resilient, to keep it secure, and you just throw an app at it, packaged however you like, maybe a container, maybe WebAssembly, whatever, and then it's done. It just handles it. But I think we're a long way from that. We're just in the ChatGPT world, not not the running and dealing with real problems yet.
Indeed. Yeah. Okay, so the next KubeCon, we might see a Kube AI or something being announced as a new CNCF project.
I mean, Paris KubeCon keynote was AI.
Excellent. Yeah, I have a whole thought about AI and open source and the CNCF, but we won't go into that zone. I might do a different talk around that but I'm not sure the community will be very happy with me and my thoughts. But anyway, that's just me being controversial. Right. Okay. So thank you all very much. I really appreciate your time. This has been absolutely fantastic. Had a really good fun. Hope you guys enjoyed it as well. And yeah, I appreciate all the insights. I think it's been very good to kind of go through the documentary a little bit, kind of use it as our sort of platform to chat about Kubernetes and it's kind of where it's come from and where it is and kind of, in the boring future that it has ahead of it, as we say. Yay. Okay. Yeah, all the links for everybody will be in the description of the video. So I'll try and provide some information, all the stuff that I dug up in the research for this talk as well. Thank you guys all for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching this talk. Please don't forget to subscribe and support the channel. Bye for now.